And good morning, everybody. How are you doing? Welcome, welcome, welcome. It's Dr. Roddenberry coming to you live from Willow Springs, North Carolina. It's 10 o'clock here on a beautiful Thursday morning. I hope everybody's doing well. If you're here, go ahead and check in the chat bar. I don't know if you're here tonight, John. John suggested I looked a little tired last night. You know what it is, John? I think I'm still jet lagged from being over in Europe because I'm waking up at 5:30 every morning, just fresh as a daisy. But about 7:30 or 8 o'clock, I just start to shut down. So I think I'm still 6 hours ahead of time, but hopefully getting better. So hopefully we have some people in the chat bar typing in to say hello. Good to see you. How's my sound coming through? Uh, Nicole, you still there? If you're there, say hello. It's good to see everybody. Cool. Uh-oh, something went wrong. Uh-oh, something went wrong. Okay, cool. You still got me? Everybody still here? Okay, fantastic. Looks like we lost some people off the broadcast. I hope nothing dropped. Let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so here we are, chapter 7, physical and cognitive development in early childhood. We talked all about physical development on Tuesday, so today we're going to focus on cognitive development from around 2 to around 5. Remember, that's what we would call early childhood. So we're going to talk a little bit about how children change. Now, let's go back and revisit this classic guy, Jean Piaget. If you remember, I introduced him several chapters ago when we talked about cognitive development in infancy. I suggested to you he was the first person to sort of suggest a theory of how the mind might evolve from an infant full of reflexes to these thoughtful, brilliant people that I see sitting in front of me here today. It's kind of old school classic. He set the stage. A lot of his beliefs and thoughts maybe weren't as rigorously tested as they could have. Modern cognitive psychologists have sort of overtaken this field and done a much better job. But Jean Piaget is the classic father of this approach. So your book, and therefore I feel like it's important just to hear a little bit about his theory of cognitive development. Thanks. Good to see you, Victory. Thanks for stopping in. Nicole says the sound's going well, so that's fine. Okay. So if you remember, he suggested human beings go through 4 mental stages: sensory motor, where we really are pre-symbolic, uh, pre-operational, where we're symbolic, not logical, concrete operational, where we're logical, but we really need to see and touch things to do our best job thinking, and then formal operational, where we are both logical and abstract. We're in the second stage, which Piaget suggested lasted from around 2 to 7, which is pretty much early childhood. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what Piaget thought this particular age grouping of children could and could not do. Good morning, Ronnie. Nice to see you. So he suggested that in children from 2 to 7 age move through a period where they started out being able to represent the world with words, images, and pictures, just like we suggested to you, drawing things, playing imaginary games, and using language. So these kids are symbolic and they can form stable concepts. And so they're in a sense, they're symbolic, but not logical. And what he suggested is that during this stage, during the latter half of this stage, the child would begin to demonstrate some logical abilities. But he suggested that by and large, kids from around the age of 2 to 4 at least were very egocentric. They were very egocentric, which means that they had trouble reasoning about things from other people's perspectives, not just selfish, but not understanding what other people know, and that these children tend to imbue objects with life, like thinking their teddy bear is alive, or talking about the sun going to bed at night. So they demonstrate animism. And children tend to have these magical beliefs, like Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny and other sort of, if you will, illogical magical beliefs. And so what he suggested is during this age, kids are starting out with this symbolic ability, but they just have these characteristics to demonstrate that they're not logical. All right. And and he argued that children sometimes tended to focus also, and I should add in centration. Sometimes when you catch a kid's attention with one dimension of an object, they have difficulty pulling back out from that dimension that they're paying attention to. They're unable to decenter from their perspective. And so he called this inability to decenter, he called it centration. So centering your attention on one characteristic to the exclusion of all others. And I'll talk about what that means in a minute. Now, he suggested that you could break this stage down into two stages. Around age 2 or 3, most children are completely illogical, he would suggest, and fell for all of these logical fallacies. But he argued starting around the age of 4, and because some of you are probably already saying, my 4-year-old has logical abilities, what he would argue is towards the end of this stage, they begin to slowly come under the control of logical constraints of the world. And so Piaget thought that from age 2 to 7, we were going through this thing he called the pre-operational, pre-logical stage, where we were symbolic but not logical, and we had these very characteristic beliefs. And he argued that as we got older in the later periods of this stage, we began to start to demonstrate some of these logical abilities. Now, the reason he says this stage goes to 7 is because in Piaget's mind, you weren't fully out of this stage until you could pass all manner of logical tests. And he had several different kinds of logical tests that he could use to show that children still weren't thinking perfectly logical and were still using some trial and error rather than reasoning, if you will. Okay, I hope that makes sense. We've got 5 people here. Hi, Renique. Good morning. Thanks to see you. So let's actually, this slide and this slide are the same thing, really. So what he would do that he could show with the youngest children is that these youngest children didn't have the ability to conserve. And by conservation, I mean understanding that if something changes its look, that doesn't necessarily mean it changes its fundamental qualities. If I was to take my cup of coffee and pour it into a tall, thin glass, and the quantity of water jumped from here all the way up to here, would you say I had more liquid? No, because you know that when I have the certain amount of liquid in this glass, no matter what I pour it into and what it looks like, it still retains the same amount of liquid. Each and every one of you has the logical ability to conserve liquid. All right. And so what he showed with 2 and 3-year-old children is that these children didn't have the ability to conserve these, to make these very basic, to demonstrate this very basic understanding about matter. So for example, if you look here, the initial presentation in the top left corner, he's got 8 balls of clay. There are 4 balls of clay here close to him and 4 balls of clay closer to the child. He then takes the balls of clay closer to him and stretches them out. It's still 4 balls of clay, but the line looks longer. He asks the child, who has more clay? Who has more balls of clay? The child will point to the line of clay balls that is longer than the other. In a sense, the child doesn't seem to have the understanding that it doesn't matter how far out the balls of clay are spread, you still don't get any more material. So in a sense here, this child that falls for this manipulation has not demonstrated the ability to conserve number. And then he would do the same thing with 2 big balls of clay. He would get 2 balls of clay and adjust them till the child said that the 2 balls of clay were the exact same size. The exact same size. And he would ask the child, and the child would say yes. He would then take one ball of clay and smush it and make it much longer. And he would say, okay, which one of these piles has more clay? And he found that the youngest children would point to the one that was squished out and longer. So in a sense, these children didn't demonstrate the ability to conserve matter. And then he could even do another, he would take two sticks the same length and have the child look at them. He would then pull one of them out to the right, and he would ask the child, which stick is longer? And the kid's eyes would follow the stick that moved. And even though the sticks are the same length, the child would point to the one that was poking out farther to the right. In a sense, this child couldn't conserve length. And he found that any number of logical tasks like this, children didn't seem to demonstrate this very basic logical ability. Now, younger kids, starting around 3 or 4, some of the kids would begin figuring these tasks out. But then he would give them things like seriation and classification. So if I gave you 50 straws of different lengths and asked you to arrange them from the shortest to the longest, you would be able to do that very easily. You would pick the shortest straw out, then you would look till you found the next shortest straw, and you would pick those straws out in order. Well, what he found was your 5 and 6-year-old kids did a lot of trial and error, making mistakes, having to move these objects around. So they couldn't engage in seriation quite as well as the 7 and 8-year-olds. And the same thing with classification. I could ask you to classify these things as winged animals and domestic animals. So we could do chickens versus vultures. We could do cows versus deer. And so I would ask you to classify using these systems. And what he found was your 5 and 6-year-old kids were still struggling a little bit trying to come up with classifications, especially if it involved using two classifications at the same time. Now, children would learn these different abilities at different times. It's not as if all of these abilities appeared at once. Some would appear before others. And he used the term the horizontal décalage just to explain the fact that kids would learn these different skills at different times, starting from the age of sort of 4 on to 5, 6, and 7. And once they were at 7, he found that he couldn't fool children on any of these tasks. And he would say that once the child could pass all these logical tasks, the child was now out of the pre-operational stage of cognitive development. Does that make sense? So Piaget thought of this sort of as an idea of more of this inability to engage in logical ideas. Now, he had an old school classic psychologist from Russia who sort of disagreed in some counts with Vygotsky. Now, according to Piaget, this development was sort of a maturational process that was happening genetically, and it represented the child exploring their own environment. Now, when it came to language and the role of language in this developmental process, Piaget didn't put much stake in the importance of language, and Piaget really did not emphasize social interaction. He really kind of conceived of the human being as a little scientist exploring their environment. But a fellow named Lev Vygotsky disagreed with his approach and said, social interaction is the fundamental aspect of cognitive development. And he argued that children think and understand primarily through their social interactions, and whereas Piaget would say children talking to themselves was nothing of importance, Lev Vygotsky thought of private talking, that is, what you're going to see is 2 and 3-year-olds when they're doing some stuff, a lot of times they'll be talking to themselves about what they're doing. And Piaget didn't think much of that, but Lev Vygotsky kind of thought of that as thinking, as the initial forms of thinking. So a lot of times when you folks are doing something, you're talking to yourself quietly in your mind and directing what you're doing. Vygotsky thought of private speech, this babbling that children would do while they were playing solo. He thought of it as sort of a rudimentary form of of thinking that would later progress into what we typically think of as rumination, our mind thinking on its own. And he argued that the more children talk to themselves, he thought he could demonstrate that that was related to their ability to social competence, their social competence. Now, here's the two things that I want you to know from Piaget's theory: the concepts of the zone of proximal development and scaffolding. According to Piaget, the reason social interaction was important was because the teacher, right. But Lev Vygotsky suggested that really the teacher was the one who could create the environment in which learning was likely to occur. And he argued that the teacher could kind of set the situation based on the child's zone of proximal development. If you've ever learned a musical instrument or a skill, you'll notice that you have to start with the easy things first. If I asked you to play Beethoven 15 minutes after I handed you a violin, you would quit because that would be way, way, way too hard for you. On the other hand, if you'd been playing violin for 15 years and you came to me to practice and I said, okay, let's play Mary Had a Little Lamb, the little nursery rhyme, you would be bored to tears. And so, in a sense, you all intuitively know that when you're learning, you are being challenged by something, but not over challenged by it, right? So, your teacher, me, I am supposed to provide you intellectual tasks that are challenging, but not too challenging. My goal is to meet you in your zone of proximal development. And that's where learning occurs. So if the child's doing something that's too easy for them, they are not going to be engaged and they're not developing their abilities. If the child, on the other hand, is engaging in something that is way, way, way above their ability, they are also not learning. And so the teacher adjusts the zone of proximal development so that the child is doing stuff even in the top part of their zone of proximal development. Where learning occurs is where we have those things where the child can do if they get a little help, if they get a little bit of help. Okay, if you've ever had work with your child as they're learning something, you'll find that sometimes they're doing something that's really hard and they can't quite do it. But if you give them one hint, they can figure that problem out. What you're doing is you are scaffolding your child at the top of their zone of proximal development. So according to Vygotsky, the really important thing for learning and intellectual development, rather than being you being a solo experimenter, was the interaction between the learner and the more experienced teacher, and the role of the teacher to provide the learner with challenging things and then scaffolding them by providing them just enough help so that they could do these things. So these are two theories on sort of how human beings learn. So Piaget and his idea of the model, the different evolutions of thinking, and Vygotsky as his role on the teacher to provide the nutrient area for growing that learning. I think Piaget was template for Vygotsky work, and therefore we all realize that social interaction play a part. You know, I love the way you say that, Ronique. Basically, I think the smart person takes both of those things into account. So you have to understand that your child's going to have perspective problems. They're going to be a little bit egocentric, and they're going to have difficulty decentering and conserving the logical properties of things. But it is your job as a parent to help them develop these skills by testing them in these situations and scaffolding their learning. I like the way Ronique thinks about it. And I would say that probably most people would sort of have the same idea that you do, Ronique. So the neat thing of Vygotsky is really, I think Vygotsky's sort of taken over in your sort of high-end boutique education like Montessori programs, or if you go to one of those really cool, expensive, unique private schools when you're in high school. Some of these schools take into account these idea Vygotsky. In fact, I had a friend, when he went to school, there was no class. He was just given stuff to learn, and he could choose what he wanted to learn. And he and his brother and each of the other kids in this really overprivileged private school just spent their time focused on, they were given within boundaries, they were given things to choose that they wanted to study. And so it was all about studying on your own. And the teacher was just there to scaffold and teach them when they had difficulty. And so in a sense, in these kinds of settings, what you're going to do is you're going to get an evaluation of the student's abilities to assess their ZPD. And then what your teachers are going to be there is they're not going to be so much the ones giving the information out to all the students. Instead, they're going to be there tutoring and scaffolding the children as they develop based upon their intellectual ability, right? And so you can use this in teaching by finding what your kid is good at and putting those more challenging activities in front of them, or being willing to scaffold your child in those situations and areas where they are struggling, right? The neat thing about this is if you're one of those cool new age teachers, you can actually, I remember when I was sitting in a classroom, a lot of times, I was sort of ahead in math. So I would always be bored as the teacher was trying to teach the students who didn't quite learn as easily or as quickly. What a teacher could do in those situations is to take someone like me, a more skilled peer, to actually help the person at the bottom of the class. And so in a sense, you can use anyone as anyone who can provide support can be the person who scaffolds. And so that sort of, if you will, democratizes education, because you can deputize students to help other students, right? And, you have to do this. And he would, of course, suggest that it has to be somewhere in a meaningful context. It has to be used in a social setting, because learning is social and learning is about interacting socially. And so you would have to learn everything application in applications. And if you think about modern education, they try to meet kids wherever they can in their ZPD, putting you in advanced classes or the other classes. They use evaluations to determine which kids need these kinds of events. And then your teachers are going to use group learning, and they are going to try to use applications. So these sort of general ideas have filtered down to modern education. Seriation. Okay, let's say I took a class of students and I wanted to arrange them for a class photo from shortest to tallest. Okay, because that's the way the picture is going to work out. Seriation would be me organizing them from shortest to longest. That's a seriation task. Okay, a seriation task. Now, what you're going to find, the reason I use that, Victory, is that an adult who did that or let you help the other student, that's scaffolding, helping the other student. Harder question. There you go. And the old school teach would give you a harder question or place you in the harder class. Exactly. And if they give you that harder question, Ronique, they might realize that they need to scaffold you a little bit. So in a sense, that modern education, even though it was happening in a classroom full of 30 people, if your teacher was good enough and had enough control and time in their classroom, what they would try to do is to meet you in your ZPD. Because the idea is to grow every student a little bit. Because if you're way ahead in the class and the teacher just has a one-size-fits-all approach and they grow everybody else, you've wasted your time that whole semester, or that whole school year. So the idea is in modern education to see if we can give each student something, no matter what their ability level, so that they can all grow during this semester. Great point, Ronique. Very good point. Okay, so here's just a chart you can look at your own interest. Vygotsky really emphasized the cultural and social nature of learning, whereas Piaget actually called his theory genetic epistemology. Epistemology is a philosophical term for knowledge, the study of knowledge, and genetic epistemology, he thought of it as the maturation of your ability to reason logically. There was absolutely no social in Piaget's theory. Okay, both of these guys suggested that the process of knowledge was based on you, the human being, building it. The question was how you built it. According to Vygotsky, you would build it through social interaction. Through Piaget, you would build it through logical tasks and the creation of more and more complex schemas. Now, Piaget, of course, had these 4 stages of development. And we're in the second one now. So we talked about sensory motor, pre-logic, pre-symbolic kids, and now we're talking about kids that are symbolic, not logical. Vygotsky didn't really worry about that too much. He instead thought of it, I'm not sure if he was apolitical about whether or not there were stages of development or whether or not it was continuous. Instead, he simply focused on this idea of ZPD and the role of the more experienced person in the social interaction as the scaffolder. And again, the terms, Vygotsky would focus on ZPD, private language, and scaffolding. And if you talked about Piaget mentioned those schemas, those basic knowledge structures, and the fact that we find out where we can use those knowledge structures, we assimilate them, or we change them when necessary, we accommodate them. And then I was just talking today about operations and the ability to conserve and classify things as logical operations. So really, Vygotsky's terms are going to relate to social forms, social interactional processes, ZPD and scaffolding, right? Vygotsky really focused on the role of language. He actually thought of it as private thought as the beginnings of rumination and thinking, whereas Piaget really wouldn't have thought, he didn't really place much emphasis in language at all in his theories. And so both Vygotsky would say that since interaction, since it's all social interaction, of course Vygotsky would really say that schooling and education is a fundamental process of the intellectual development, whereas Piaget would argue that, your intellectual abilities are evolving whether or not you go to formal schooling or not. And he would argue that education just refines those basic abilities. And there is some logic to his approach. Even if you didn't go to school, I'll bet you after a while you would begin to realize that Santa Claus was an impossibility. You wouldn't have to go to school not to believe that. Or would you? I'm not sure. But they would differ on their views on education. And then and so really they would both say the teacher has a role in education, but for Vygotsky, the role would be to act as a facilitator and a tutor, whereas Piaget, basically you would maybe just be setting up the situation for the laboratory for your little learner to come through and experiment on their own. So both of you would be trying to create an engaging intellectual environment for your child, but Vygotsky, you would then help the child develop their abilities in that environment, whereas Piaget, I guess you could maybe just go outside and have a sandwich while your child, the little experimenter, did their own form of learning. I hope that sort of gives you the appreciation between these two guys. Now, again, these are olds. Exactly, the cow jumping over the moon. At some point, that might seem ridiculous. So what I do want you to understand is that these guys sort of are bedrock foundational in the development of this idea of human learning. Vygotsky focusing on the importance of the social interaction that we get in our classrooms and in our lives, and Piaget talking about the changing nature of cognition. But these two guys are both considered really, really old school and, if you will, out of date scientifically. Instead, as we talked about last week, there are sort of more modern cognitive approaches that developed out of the cognitive revolution in the 60s that like to think of human beings as information processors. If you were in my Psych 150 class, I really tried to convey to you the idea that the cognitive approach was built on the premise that human information processing and computer information processing systems have some similarities. Where those similarities end and where they begin are areas for discussion, but just like a computer has a software, has an operating system that guides how it processes information, human beings have an operating system that guides how we process information. And so the modern cognitive approach looks at human beings as they develop through these different age periods, asking in what ways are younger children's informational processing abilities limited to compared to the average adult. So in the early days of cognitive research, they found out what adults could do, what the adult short-term memory size was, how long adults could remember things, what adults could remember. So in the early days, it was finding out what an adult could do. Cognitive developmental research, the modern cognitive approach to developmental psychology, now asks the question, how do these abilities that we know exist in adult, what is their pattern of development over the course of childhood? Hope that makes sense. And so one of the informational processes that human beings engage in is the marshaling and directing of our attention. Okay, so attention, what is it? It is your ability to gather your resources and point them in a certain direction. After having done that, attention is your ability to maintain that level of focus for a certain amount of time. So we can ask, in what direction does attention go, and is it able to follow things that are in its path? How large that attentional ability is, how many things can we focus on at what time? And we can also ask the question, how long can we maintain that focused attention? So the ability to attend to something and to focus on it properly are questions that modern cognitive developmental psychologists will ask. So how exactly do we focus attention? Now, executive attention, you can think about attention in two ways. Not only what you pay attention to, but how long you can maintain that attention, which is we call sustained attention. And then executive attention is using your attentional processes in an effective manner. So an executive is in charge of controlling things. So how good are your how efficient are your attentional processes? How good are you at planning how you're going to look at something? How good are you at determining when you've made an error in looking at something? And how good are you in knowing when you are done looking at something? So this is sort of the executive control of your attention, and then how long you can pay attention, right? Now, what you're going to find is that children's attentional abilities are deficient in two ways compared to their executive attention, I should say, is impaired with adults' executive attention in two major ways. Number one, children tend to pay attention to the correct things, So when I'm asked the child maybe to pay attention to the story of what the ducks buy at the grocery store, if I put the ducks in funny, colorful outfits and tell a story, the child may pay attention to the funny, colorful outfits rather than what they were supposed to be paying attention to. So what you're going to find is that children around 2, 3, and 4 when you ask them to pay attention to a story, they often don't pay attention to the right parts of the story. They pay attention to things that stick out and are colorful or funny. I hope that makes sense. And then children, they are not as planful and as systematic in the use of their attentional processes, right? So here you go. If I was asking you to look at these 4 buildings and tell me which 2 buildings have the same exact things hanging in the window, okay, you would compare them by looking left, right, top to bottom of each of these objects, comparing them. And every time you got to 2 and there was a different, you would eliminate one of them till you found the top 2. And you would quickly see that it's the top 2 that have the same exact things in them. But in order to do that, the question is, how systematic would you be in your search strategies? Now, they use these eye tracking devices, and what they'll show you is that when adults do this task, they look left to right, top to bottom, and do a very systematic search of every window. What you're going to find with your 3-year-old is they're going to look maybe down in the bottom, then up in the top, and they're not going to be very systematic in their search. And so they're not going to be as planful. So what you're going to see is that children during this age, their executive attention is not as good as it's going to be as adults. Now, research of Hungarian children found that this is actually a skill that can be developed. They designed these computer programs that help their children to develop this executive attentional skill. Now, what I do tell all my students regarding memory and intellectual functioning, it is not something that you are just born with. You have to develop it. It is a skill, just like riding a bike or playing the piano or anything else. And so what this research with these Hungarian children found is that you can actually develop these executive abilities. And so this is something, so rather than immediately teaching us facts and knowledge, I think it would be cool if our kindergartens and first grades taught our kids how to think. You know what I mean? That meta memory, that executive skill. But what you're going to see is that, and now, so that's what we would call executive attention. But then sustained attention, what you're going to find is that that develops over the course of this time from 10 to 30 seconds, sort of at your 2-year-old, to your 5 and 6-year-old kids who can pay attention for a couple of minutes. And this sustained attention is going to be very important for school readiness. If your child isn't paying attention, you send them to school, they are going to do poorly because they can't pay attention. Now, sustained attention at 4.5 years predicts school readiness in kindergarten and achievement by 9 years of age, and college completion by 25 years of age. And I'm not talking about just people with ADD, but there are all variations in your ability to sustain and focus your attention. And so an important indicator of whether or not you're going to send your kid to kindergarten at 4 years and 10 months of age rather than the typical 5 years of age is going to depend upon their ability to sustain attention. And sustained attention at this age is going to be very important, as you can see, throughout their academic life. Okay. Now, so that's talking about your ability to pay attention. Let's talk about the things that you can hold in your mind at one time. Now, in Psych 150, I told you about this term called the short-term memory, your short-term memory store. That's the number of things you can consciously think about at one time. And this is really controlled by your frontal lobes, your ability to keep things in your mind. For example, Shamay, if I was to tell you that I needed you to pick some things up from the grocery store on your way home from school, I might start giving you a list on the top of my head. Yes, that is connected to chunking, retrieval cues, and memory and learning. Yes, yes, yes. And executive functioning is learning how to use chunking and retrieval cues. So I mentioned executive functioning, executive attention as planning, error detection, and progress monitoring. Those are just the things, the basic levels of things. But if you want to be good in school, you have to develop these other executive abilities, like Victory says. People who are good at memorizing things and memorizing lists know how to chunk material. They know how to make vivid images. They know how to use retrieval cues. Those are executive abilities. But you know what? We don't even really focus so much on those in developmental psychology because they're not a common part of most people's intellectual functioning. Great question, Victory. Okay, but yes, those of you who know how to keep lots of things in your short-term memory have learned how to chunk, right? So yesterday I was doing a memory lecture and I told a student that she needed to pick up bread, butter, and some ham, and also potatoes and dishwashing detergent from the grocery store. And I gave her those 5 items real quickly. Now, it could be hard to remember those things unless you want to chunk them into 2 things. I told her to think about the fact that I wanted a grilled cheese and ham sandwich. So you need butter, bread, and cheese, and cheese and meat for that. Okay, boom. And then I told her to think about me washing the potatoes because I wanted a potato with my dinner. And so the detergent and the potato kind of chunked together. And so it's really easy to sort of put these things into larger lists and increase the size of your short-term memory. But psychologists have studied the size of children's short-term memory. Now, the average short-term memory is thought to be somewhere between 7 plus or minus 2 chunks. Those chunks being something you can decide. But that's how big our short-term memory is. What you're going to see is that children at the age of 2 they can remember 2 things. After that, can't do anymore. But about 7-year-olds, they're going to have 5 digits, but they're still not going to be to their adult short-term memory size. And this is due to, as we said, their poor executive control. You become a little better at the chunking and the memory strategies. And their brains, remember we're talking about the blooming and pruning. Your brain's not going to work as fast as it possibly can until you prune all those unused neural connections away. So children are not going to have as big a short-term memory during this period. It's developing and it's increasing through this period, but still, even at 7 years old, it's not quite as good as it's going to be at adulthood. And then we can think about long-term memories. Now, long-term memories are those things that are not in your mind right now, but things that you can call up into your mind. So, for example, Victory, if I was to ask you who was the first president of the United States, you could probably tell me who that was. Go ahead and type that in the chat bar. If anybody else knows who is our current president, can anybody tell us who our current president is? Right? If you know the answer to either of those questions, you clearly were not thinking about those 2 people until I asked the question. However, you were quickly able to pull George Washington and Joe Biden into your conscious awareness. Those things were stored in your long-term memory. How good are children's long-term memory? Now, this is often an important question because sometimes children are asked to go into court and testify about things that happened at their house. It is very important to know how reliable children's long-term memories are. Okay? Now, what we're going to find is that memory is not very accurate for 2- and 3-year-olds, but it does get better as a child gets older. Not for the events that happened earlier, but events so your memory for events that happened 2 are not going to be very good. Your memory for events at 3 or 4 are going to be a little bit better, but still not good. Your memory for events at 5 or 6 are going to be better, but still not great. All right. Now, why is this important? It's important because a lot of times children are asked to give testimony in court. And what psychologists have found is that children are especially susceptible to suggestion, and younger children even more so than older children. So if I use the doll technique, we do this sometimes in childhood abuse cases, we'll say, did he touch you here? Did he touch you here on the dolly? He touched you. Did he touch you here on the dolly? And if you suggest that a couple of times, sometimes doctors touch kids right here, and this isn't inappropriate. Sometimes a good interviewer can cause a kid to remember something that didn't happen. And it definitely, interviewing techniques, especially if you reward the kid for saying the thing you think they are going to say, what you will find is that children can easily be distorted to remember things that from highly salient events, from very important events. They will absolutely put things in that are bizarre and not part of the memory. I'm reminded of a court case that happened probably 30 some odd years ago here in North Carolina. It was called the Little Rascals Daycare case. And this fellow named Jim Kelly was accused, he and his staff were accused of sexually abusing probably 40 kids at a daycare. And these folks were all convicted and given life sentences based on the testimony of these children that were all interviewed by the same therapist. And the weird thing is, a lot of these people supported Jim Kelly and said there was no way that it happened, and their kids did not report this abuse until they were interviewed by this therapist working on the case. And almost to a person, every child, after being interviewed by this therapist, remembered being touched inappropriately by Mr. Kelly and his colleagues. Now, among these memories of being touched and things you might believe, some of these kids remembered other children being fed to alligators and other children being thrown up and speared on spears. And so these children recalled incredibly miraculous, crazy, and insane things that could not possibly have happened, along with these memories of being sexually abused. Now, in the first case, all these people were convicted and given life sentences. These convictions were eventually overturned because these eyewitness testimony by these children in early childhood were deemed unreliable, but not after everybody in the case's life was ruined. In a sense, so what we know is that children's long-term memory is unreliable, more unreliable the younger they are, still unreliable at 5 or 6, and that there is variation and that we need to be careful how we use children's long-term memories when we go into forensic psychological situations. Okay, so now another form of executive functioning. I know I've mentioned executive functioning a couple of times. One way we demonstrate executive functioning is by controlling our impulses. We inhibit strong but incorrect tendencies. We are able to shift our attention when we need to and learn how to pay attention to the thing that our teacher wants to. And we know how to set goals and delay gratification. Self-control is an executive functioning that is very important, that needs to be stimulated during this very critical period in early childhood. Advances in executive functioning are associated with math skills, language development, school readiness, and emergency literacy. So not along with learning how to pay attention and to do search tasks appropriately, the child needs to learn how to control their impulses and pay attention when they need to. This is a skill that, again, is learned and needs to be stimulated during this critical period here in early childhood. Now, one famous example done by a fellow named McGuire, who actually believed that personality wasn't important. He did research that suggested that really, if you know a person's personality, it does not predict much in the way of their future behavior. So he made crazy statements like personality doesn't matter or personality doesn't exist. What he thought was more important was the ability to control one's impulses. And he suggested learning about knowing how one controlled one's impulses was more important than knowing anything about their personality. And so what he did was this thing called the marshmallow experiment. And what they would do is they would take children in early childhood, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and put them in a room with a marshmallow on a plate. See this young lady sat mournfully looking at a marshmallow. Now they would put them in the room with this marshmallow and they would tell the child, here's the deal. You can eat this one marshmallow now. Or if you'll wait for 10 minutes, I will give you 2 marshmallows. Now I have to go away for 10 minutes, and when I come back, if you've eaten this marshmallow, you're done. But if you haven't eaten this marshmallow, when I come back in 10 minutes, I'll give you another one and you'll have 2 marshmallows. So it's the classic can you control your impulses experiment. And they're placed in the room and given a marshmallow. And so can the child control their impulses? Now, of course, what he found was that children were absolutely angst-ridden while they sat there and dealt with this marshmallow that they really wanted to eat. Look at how sad this girl looks. You know she wants to eat this marshmallow. Some of these kids would even pick their marshmallow up and lick it. Some would nibble the corners as if nobody would notice. And some of them just couldn't help it and would just eat that marshmallow, right? But some were able to refrain from eating that marshmallow and got the second marshmallow as a reward. Now, of course, what he found was that older children were better able to delay their gratification than younger children. So this executive function of impulse control did improve from 2 to 5 years of age. He also found that parents could coach their children. And so you could use, and again, think of Vygotsky's idea of scaffolding. Controlling my impulse is really, really tough for me. So a little bit of verbal coaching could help children develop this impulse control. And this is what you as parents should do with your children. Take that away from this, right? But what they also found was that there were individual differences at 2 years old, 3 years old, 4 years old, and 5 years old of children being able to control their impulses. And he found that the children who were able to control their impulse and pass the marshmallow test had better academic outcomes later on in life. They were going to have higher SAT scores, higher GPAs in college. They coped more effectively with stress, and they wound up being more successful as adults. Now, think about it. Going to college is a practice of delaying gratification. This is not fun, but you're doing this because you are thinking about something that's going to occur in the future. Working hard and going to work instead of going out to party. These are things that are going to help you do better in your work world and make more money. Delay of gratification is an executive functioning that develops during these years that is very important for your outcomes later in life. And so, as it's suggested here that parents can scaffold their children with the marshmallow study, I invite you as parents of children this age is to help your child get over their impulse control problems. All children want the marshmallow. It's up to you. And I know your kid may want to cry if they don't get it, but it's up to you to help them develop this very important and very useful ability. Okay, and then finally, really quick, theory of mind is knowing how minds work. So I know what I know, and I know what you don't know. I know a secret. There's something that happened to me today that I'm not going to tell you about. I know that you don't know that because I understand the theory of mind. People can hide things in their mind. And the weird thing is, this knowledge is not instantaneous. It's not apparent in the 2-year-old child. It grows over the course of the first from 2 to 5. And children will become really bad liars at 2 because they don't know that you don't know. And by 5 or 6, your child's going to know that they can lie to you because they will develop this thing called the theory of mind. Now, children develop these abilities. They understand that people see other things that they are. People have different perceptions. They learn really early at 2 and 3 that people may want other things. Maybe I like the crackers, but you like the broccoli. And children will begin to understand that other people can have different emotions. Just because I'm sad does not mean you're sad. Just because that young boy is angry does not mean I have to be angry. So children are going to develop the ability to understand that other people have different thoughts, perceptions, emotions, and desires. And children are going to begin to understand at some point, and you can look at this graph right here, that other people can be misled or have false memories, right? Okay, I have run all out of time. I am so sorry for that. I want to thank everybody for coming today. We had 7 at the top, at the biggest part of our broadcast, and we finished with 5, which I think is a good number. Hey, thanks everybody for coming last night to the webinar. I hope you enjoyed the webinar. And like I said, we talked a little bit about controlling impulses last night in the webinar, and I want you to know that this executive function of impulse control and delaying gratification is a skill that you need to help your 2, 3, and 4-year-old develop. You need to scaffold this ability. And if you don't, it's okay, but your child's going to have more difficulty later in life if you don't help them. Delayed gratification takes a lot of discipline. It takes a lot of practice. It takes trial and error. Absolutely, Victoria. And so it's important that we help our children begin this process of delaying. Don't say, well, she's 2 years old. How can I expect her to be able to delay gratification? No. What you should say is, she's 2 years old. I need to start helping her bit by bit develop her ability to delay gratification. All right, folks, fantastic. It's been a great day. It's now 10:55. I want you to know that I had a great time. Do the discussion board that's due tonight so you can get credit or extra credit as the case may be. And your week 7 homework is due tonight or tomorrow night at 11:59 p.m. Take care and have a great day. Bye.